In the hallowed silence of Westminster Abbey, beneath a canopy of carved stone and royal effigies, lies a secret far more grotesque than the sanitized histories would have you believe. We are taught to remember Queen Elizabeth I as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of England's golden age, an almost immortal figure, forever pristine in her ruff and pearls. But this is a carefully constructed myth, a political lie solidified in marble. The truth lies deeper, within a lead-lined coffin that, for a time, held a horror so potent, so biologically rebellious, that it threatened to shatter the very illusion of majesty it was meant to contain. The true story of Elizabeth's final days and the gruesome fate of her corpse is not a tale of a revered monarch as peaceful passing. It is a descent into a macabre theater of political anxiety, psychological torment, and the shocking, putrid reality of a body in revolt. This is the story of how the most powerful woman in the world rotted from within, how her own flesh waged a final, desperate war against the myth she had so carefully built, and how her coffin, in a final act of grotesque defiance, became a stinking, pressurized vessel of corruption that terrified the very men who sought to control her legacy. To understand what happened in that coffin, you must first understand the unspeakable horror of her death. The final years of Queen Elizabeth I's reign were a masterclass in the politics of illusion. The golden age was tarnishing, its luster fading with the Queen's own vitality. The vibrant, sharp-witted monarch who had faced down the Spanish Armada and played the princes of Europe against each other was gone, replaced by a spectral figure haunted by ghosts of the past and the encroaching shadow of her own mortality. The court around her had transformed from a stage for her brilliance into a silent, anxious death watch. Her most trusted advisers, Burleigh, Walsingham, Leicester, were all dead, leaving her in a profound and terrifying isolation. The execution of her last great favorite, the Earl of Essex, in 1601 had broken something deep within her. It was a political necessity, but it was also the death of the last reflection of her own youth. She was an icon aging in a world that demanded she remain eternally the same, a goddess whose divinity was cracking under the strain of being merely human. The most visible manifestation of this struggle was her face. For decades, Elizabeth had relied on a toxic cosmetic called Venetian cerus, a concoction of white lead and vinegar, to create her iconic pale mask of youth. This mask was not vanity. It was armor. It concealed the scars of a near-fatal bout of smallpox from her youth, and as she aged, the wrinkles and blemishes of time. But this armor was poisoning her. The lead was slowly seeping into her system, contributing to her hair loss, digestive problems, and most critically, her mental and emotional deterioration. A mask of youthful majesty was, in reality, a death mask she wore while still alive. Her ladies-in-waiting, sworn to secrecy, would spend hours each morning layering on the thick, white paste, painting over the decay with the very substance that was accelerating it. The court colluded in this fiction, pretending not to notice the rotting teeth, blackened by sugar, and decay, which made her speech difficult to understand, or the increasingly ill-fitting wigs that hid her thinning gray hair. They were all actors in a grand, silent play, the title of which was The Queen is Immortal. But behind the painted facade, the biological reality was inescapable. Elizabeth was dying, and the entire political stability of the kingdom rested on pretending she was not. This disconnect between the political symbol of Gloriana and the decaying woman in the palace, his private chambers, created an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension, a fragile illusion that was about to be shattered by the Queen's final stubborn act of defiance against her own body. The final descent began in the cold, damp winter of 1603. The death of her close friend and cousin, the Countess of Nottingham, seemed to be the final blow that shattered the Queen's formidable will to live. A profound, impenetrable melancholy settled over her, a darkness that no courtly entertainment or physician's remedy could pierce. She retreated into a state of silent, stubborn despair, a final protest against the indignity of her own decay. It was then that she began her last, strange stand. Convinced that if she lay down in bed she would never rise again, Elizabeth refused to sleep. For days, then weeks, she stood, leaning against cushions piled on the floor by her terrified ladies-in-waiting. Her body, already weakened by age and illness, was being subjected to an unimaginable endurance test. Her legs swelled, her joints ached, and her mind, already clouded by grief and lead poisoning, began to drift into a twilight state between lucidity and delirium. This was not just the act of a stubborn old woman. It was a final desperate assertion of will by a monarch who had controlled her world for nearly half a century and now found herself losing control of the one territory she could not command, her own flesh. The royal physicians were paralyzed with terror. They knew she needed rest, that her refusal to lie down was suicidal, but who among them dared to lay hands on the sacred person of the Queen? To force her into bed would be an act of treason, an unthinkable violation of her absolute authority. They pleaded, they reasoned, they offered potions, but she remained resolute, a silent, unmoving statue of grief and defiance. Her court, led by the shrewd and ever-watchful Sir Robert Cecil, understood the terrifying political implications of this scene. The Queen was no longer ruling. She was merely existing, a flickering candle in a drafty room. The business of government ground to a halt. Foreign ambassadors sent panicked reports back to their own courts. The succession, a topic Elizabeth had forbidden on pain of death for her entire reign, was now the only thing that mattered. While the Queen stood silently against her cushions, Cecil was already engaged in a flurry of secret treasonous correspondence with her likely successor, King James VI of Scotland. The transition of power was being engineered in the shadows, while the current monarch was still alive, a silent, upright corpse presiding over the dissolution of her own authority. This period of the Death Watch was a macabre theater of powerlessness. The most absolute monarch in Europe was reduced to a catatonic state, surrounded by courtiers who were forced to maintain the fiction of her authority while desperately plotting for the moment it would end. The silence in the royal apartments was deafening, a vacuum into which the future of England was being drawn. It was a testament to the ultimate loneliness of absolute power. Surrounded by everyone, yet utterly alone, her final battle fought not against foreign enemies, but against her own collapsing body and mind. The strange, silent vigil of the standing Queen could not last. After nearly 2 weeks of this self-inflicted torture, her body finally betrayed her will. Her council, led by Robert Cecil, took the audacious step of forcing the issue. They reasoned with her, they pleaded, and finally, in a moment that signified the true end of her power, they physically moved her. They did not dare place her in the royal bed, a place she now associated with death, but gently lowered her onto a sea of cushions piled upon the floor. There she remained, silent, her eyes open, refusing food, seeing phantoms in the corners of the room. The power had now decisively shifted. The Queen was an object, a problem to be managed. Robert Cecil was the de facto ruler of England, his every action now geared towards ensuring a smooth and bloodless transition of power to the Scottish king. He controlled all access to the Queen's chambers, isolating her from any who might challenge his plans. He secured the Tower of London, put the Navy on alert, and prepared the official proclamations. The government of King James was essentially being assembled in the hallways of Richmond Palace, while the last of the Tudors lay dying on the floor. In her rare moments of lucidity, the court desperately tried to elicit a sign from her about the succession. The official story, almost certainly a piece of brilliant political theater crafted by Cecil, is that when they named the King of Scotland, she made a sign with her hand, tracing the shape of a crown in the air. This gesture, likely fabricated or misinterpreted, became the legal and symbolic cornerstone of the Stuart succession, a final, convenient command from a queen who had spent her life refusing to give it. As her condition worsened, the atmosphere grew thick with religious ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, knelt by her side for hours, praying for her soul. She was now beyond speech, but she held his hand, squeezing it to show she was listening, that she understood. The end came quietly in the cold, early hours of March 24th, 1603. Her breathing grew shallow, and she slipped away. The last of the Tudors, the great Gloriana, was dead. The immediate reaction was not an outpouring of grief, but a flurry of precisely executed political maneuvers. The news of her death was suppressed. For hours, London slept on, unaware that the anchor of their world for 45 years had come loose. Cecil's plan, years in the making, snapped into motion. Messengers were already riding hard for Scotland, carrying the secret news to the new king. The gates of the palace were locked. The official announcement would wait until the council had formally proclaimed the succession, ensuring no rival claimant could make a move. No popular uprising could destabilize the state. The Queen's death was a political event first, a personal tragedy a distant second. While the politicians and soldiers secured the kingdom, a different kind of work began in the silent, stuffy death chamber, the grim task of dealing with the Queen's mortal remains. And it was here that the long-suppressed reality of her physical decay would make its final, horrifying stand against the myth of her eternal majesty. The problem began almost immediately. The Queen's body, emaciated from her long fast, but weakened by a lifetime of illness and a final, grueling death, began to decompose with alarming speed. The long period of standing had caused fluids to pool in her lower body, and her refusal of nourishment had left her system with no resources to fight the inevitable bacterial invasion. She was, in essence, beginning to rot from the inside out even before she took her final breath. The royal embalmers were summoned, but they faced a challenge unlike any they had encountered. Embalming a royal body was a standard procedure, a ritualized process of evisceration and preservation. But Elizabeth's corpse was fragile, its internal systems already breaking down. According to a contemporary account by the courtier Elizabeth Southwell, who was present, the process was a grotesque horror. When the embalmers made their first incision, they were met with a wave of foul-smelling gas and putrid fluid. The decay was far more advanced than they had anticipated. The organs were removed, and the body cavity was washed with wines and spices, a futile attempt to mask the stench of corruption that now filled the room. The body was packed with preserving agents and tightly wrapped in waxed linen, a mummy of majesty. It was then placed in a coffin lined with lead, designed to be airtight, to contain the royal remains and the secrets of their decay for eternity. The coffin was sealed, and the official period of mourning could begin. But the biological processes set in motion during the Queen's agonizing decline were not so easily contained. The very measures taken to preserve her, the airtight lead lining, would become the instruments of a final, macabre spectacle. The official narrative demanded a grand and solemn lying in state. But the reality of the Queen's corpse was too volatile, too odorous. So the body itself was kept hidden. Instead, a life-sized effigy was created, a masterpiece of propaganda. A wooden and plaster body was dressed in the Queen's own coronation robes. A wax head was expertly molded and painted to resemble her in her prime, and the whole creation was adorned with the crown and scepter. This perfect, serene doll became the public face of the dead Queen. For weeks, this effigy lay in state at Whitehall Palace, a silent, unchanging symbol of eternal majesty. Thousands of mourners filed past, weeping for the goddess they had lost, unaware that the real body, sealed in its leaden prison nearby, was undergoing a monstrous transformation. Inside the coffin, the anaerobic bacteria that had thrived in her decaying organs were still at work. They continued to break down the tissues, producing a massive volume of gas methane, sulfur dioxide, and other products of decomposition. In a normal wooden coffin, these gases might slowly seep out. But within the sealed lead box, they had nowhere to go. The pressure began to build, slowly, inexorably. The lead coffin, designed to contain her, was becoming a pressurized bomb of corruption. The courtiers and guards responsible for watching over the body became aware of the problem through the most primal of senses: smell. Despite the lead and the spices, a faint, sweet, cloying stench began to permeate the chamber, the unmistakable odor of advanced decay. Then came the sounds, a horrifying creaking and groaning from within the coffin, as the lead, a soft metal, began to bulge under the immense internal pressure. Then, according to the account of Elizabeth Southwell, it happened. There was a sickening crack, a pop, as the body and entrails within the coffin, loaded with gas, burst. The coffin itself, weakened by the pressure, ruptured. A wave of indescribably foul vapor was released, a final putrid exhalation from the Queen's rebellious flesh. The guards were thrown into a panic. This was a state secret of the most horrifying kind. The myth of the immortal Queen was literally exploding. Frantic efforts were made to contain the disaster, to mask the smell with yet more incense and herbs, to silence the witnesses. But the truth was out, at least within the inner circle of the court. The body of Gloriana had declared its own, final, messy truth. It was not a divine relic. It was decaying matter, subject to the same inexorable laws of biology as the humblest of her subjects. The carefully constructed image of eternal preservation had been shattered by the brute force of its own putrefaction. The public, of course, knew nothing of this backstage horror. For them, the Queen remained the perfect, serene effigy. When the day of her funeral arrived, it was this effigy that was the star of the show. On April 28, 1603, a vast procession snaked through the streets of London. It was a masterpiece of political theater, a city draped in black, the air filled with the tolling of bells and the sounds of staged public grief. The Queen's coffin, now presumably repaired and resealed, was drawn on a chariot pulled by 4 black-draped horses. But perched atop it, dominating the entire spectacle, was the effigy, looking more real and more regal than the dead Queen had in years. This was the final, brilliant act of propaganda. The public mourned a doll, a fiction, while the grim reality of what lay inside the box was carefully hidden from view. The procession was a symbolic bridging of 2 eras. It was the funeral for the last Tudor, but it was also a welcome for the first Stuart, whose accession had been so smoothly managed. The ceremony was not just about mourning the past. It was about consecrating the future, about demonstrating the seamless and divinely ordained continuity of the monarchy. The coffin was carried into Westminster Abbey, the traditional resting place of kings, and lowered into the vault of her grandfather, Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. It was a fitting, temporary resting place, bringing the dynasty full circle. The last Tudor was laid to rest with the first. The myth had been secured, the decaying reality sealed away beneath the stone floor of the abbey. The secret of the stinking coffin had been contained, or so they thought. The story, too grotesque to be an official record, survived in the letters and diaries of those who were there, a whispered, horrifying footnote to the grand public narrative. It serves as the ultimate metaphor for Elizabeth's reign, a beautiful, powerful, and carefully constructed exterior, hiding a reality of decay, danger, and political maneuvering. The illusion of her immortality was, in the end, her legacy. But her body had other ideas. In one final biological spasm, it had screamed its own terrible truth, that even the most powerful monarchs are subject to the same ignominious end as all living things. They rot, they swell, and sometimes they explode. A few years after her initial burial, King James I, in a move of profound historical and psychological significance, ordered the construction of a new magnificent tomb for Elizabeth, but she would not lie in it alone. James had the body of his own mother, Mary, Queen Ophots, a Catholic rival whom Elizabeth had imprisoned for nearly 20 years, and ultimately executed, exhumed, and brought to Westminster. He then had Elizabeth's coffin moved from her grandfather's vault, and placed in the same tomb as the half-sister she had loathed and feared, Mary I, Bloody Mary. Finally, in a grand gesture of filial piety and political reconciliation, he erected a spectacular monument to his mother, directly across the aisle from Elizabeth's. The final resting place of the Virgin Queen is therefore a chamber of astonishing irony. She lies atop her Catholic sister, the one who had tried to drag England back to Rome. The tomb's inscription famously reads, "Consorts in throne and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of the resurrection." It is a lie written in stone, a forced reconciliation in death between two women who were bitter rivals in life. And across from her, forever in her sightline, is the tomb of the other Mary, the one she had beheaded. Westminster Abbey, for Elizabeth, is not a place of peaceful rest, but a posthumous prison, forced to share eternity with the two women who represented the greatest threats to her life and reign. What can a modern, scientific perspective tell us about the horrors of Elizabeth's final days? The lead-based Venetian cerus she used for decades would have caused chronic lead poisoning. The symptoms are a chilling match for her later years: hair loss, dental decay, intestinal problems, and most tellingly, neurological damage leading to memory loss, irritability, and depression. Her deep melancholy was not just grief. It was clinical chemical depression induced by the very makeup she used to project an image of health and power. Her final illness, the refusal to eat or lie down, and the rapid decomposition, points towards a body in systemic failure. The long period of standing would have led to massive edema in her legs and compromised her circulation, creating ideal conditions for blood clots and sepsis. Her refusal of food and water would have led to kidney failure and dehydration, accelerating the shutdown of her organs. She was, in essence, a perfect storm of pathologies. The explosion in the coffin is also entirely plausible from a forensic standpoint. The process of putrefaction in an anaerobic environment, such as a sealed lead coffin, produces a massive amount of gas. This is a well-documented phenomenon known as bloating. Given the state of her body at the time of death and the warm spring weather, the rate of gas production would have been rapid. The lead of a 17th century coffin, being a soft and malleable metal, could easily have been distorted, split at the seams, or ruptured by the immense pressure from within. The accounts of the event, while sensational, are entirely consistent with the grim science of human decomposition. Elizabeth I's death, therefore, can be seen as a form of rebellion by her own biology. For 45 years, she had subjected her body to the immense strain of absolute rule. She denied it marriage. She denied it children. She painted it with poison to conform to a political ideal. And in the end, she denied it the simple dignity of rest. Her body, in its final, grotesque moments, asserted its own non-negotiable truth. It refused to be a pristine relic. It insisted on its own messy, smelly, and explosive mortality. The story of her coffin is the story of the ultimate failure of propaganda in the face of nature. Cecil and the new Stuart regime could control the narrative, the public ceremonies, and the stone inscriptions, but they could not control the fundamental processes of decay. The final legacy of Elizabeth, then, is this profound and disturbing duality. There is the myth, the effigy, the marble tomb of Gloriana, the immortal queen, forever powerful, forever serene. And then there is the reality of the stinking coffin, the burst corpse, the poisoned and broken old woman who fought death with stubborn fury and lost. The truth of her story lies in the tension between the two. She was a political genius who built a nation's identity around her own, but she was also a human being who suffered a terrible and lonely end. In remembering her, we must remember not just the crown and the scepter, but the lead. Paint the blackened teeth, and the horrifying final secret of her coffin, a secret that speaks to the ultimate humbling reality that awaits all power, no matter how absolute. The physical and psychological torment of Elizabeth's final years was a direct consequence of the impossible role she had written for herself. As the Virgin Queen, her body was not her own. It was a symbol of the state, a representation of an inviolable and independent England. To maintain this potent political fiction, she had to remain unmarried and ostensibly untouched. This meant that as she aged, she could not retreat into the private life of a wife or mother. She had to remain on public display, her body the literal embodiment of the nation's health. This created an unbearable pressure to arrest the process of aging. Her use of lead makeup, her elaborate wigs, her magnificent, structured gowns that disguised the shape of her aging body, all were political necessities. The mask of youth was a state policy, but this policy had a terrible cost. The lead poisoning exacerbated her natural tendencies toward paranoia and melancholy, traits she likely inherited from her famously unstable mother, Anne Boleyn, and her tyrannical father, Henry VIII. The court she presided over in her later years was a place of deep psychological dysfunction. It was a court of old men and young schemers, a place where genuine affection was a dangerous weakness. Elizabeth's relationships were transactional, her emotions weaponized. She played her favorites against each other, demanding absolute devotion while trusting no one. This created an atmosphere of intense paranoia and insecurity that mirrored her own internal state. The execution of the Earl of Essex was the psychological breaking point. In him, she had seen a final, flattering reflection of her own youthful spirit. To sign his death warrant was, in a sense, to sign her own. Her subsequent decline into a deep, unresponsive depression is a classic psychological reaction to such a profound loss and betrayal. Her refusal to go to bed can be interpreted not just as a fear of death, but as a symptom of severe clinical depression, where the patient feels unworthy of comfort or rest. It was a form of self-punishment, a physical manifestation of her internal despair. The silence she maintained in her final days was her last weapon. In a world where her every word had been law, her refusal to speak was a final, terrifying act of control. It plunged her court into chaos, forcing them to guess at her intentions, to project their own desires onto her silent form. It was a passive-aggressive masterpiece of psychological warfare, the last act of a queen who had always ruled by keeping her true intentions veiled. The men around her, particularly Robert Cecil, responded with their own form of psychological manipulation. Cecil, a master of intrigue, likely saw the queen's decline not with pity, but with a cold, calculating pragmatism. He needed to manage her, to contain her, to extract from her the necessary legitimacy for the succession he had already arranged. The scene of her naming James as her successor by tracing a crown in the air is a perfect example of this. It was a moment of profound ambiguity that Cecil seized upon and transformed into an undeniable historical fact, using the Queen's weakened mental state to serve his own political ends. She was, in her final days, a victim of the very system of absolute personal monarchy that she had perfected. Her power was so total, so tied to her physical presence, that her decline created a vacuum that could only be filled by intrigue and conspiracy. She had built a world that could not function without her, and then she was forced to watch, in silent horror, as it began to move on before she was even dead. The story of her death is a case study in the psychological cost of power, a grim illustration of how a life spent in the service of a political illusion can lead to a final, devastating confrontation with a reality that can no longer be controlled, painted over, or denied. The court of the dying Elizabeth was a microcosm of the anxieties of a kingdom on the brink of profound change. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled for over a century and had come to define the very idea of Englishness, was ending. The death of the Queen was not just the death of a person. It was the death of an era. This sense of impending change created a volatile and dangerous atmosphere. There was widespread public fear of what would come next. Would the succession be contested? Would Spain use the moment of weakness to attack? Would the religious conflicts that Elizabeth had so skillfully managed reignite into civil war? These were not abstract fears. They were real and present dangers. The official story of the Queen's peaceful passing and the seamless transition to King James was a necessary fiction designed to quell these fears. The reality was far more precarious. The actions of Robert Cecil and the Privy Council in those final days were not just prudent. They were a desperate gamble to prevent the kingdom from descending into chaos. The suppression of the news of her death was a critical part of this strategy. London was a tinderbox of rumors and political factions. A premature announcement could have triggered riots or attempts by rival claimants to seize power. Cecil needed to control the narrative completely, to present the accession of James not as a political arrangement, but as the fulfillment of Elizabeth's sacred dying wish. The public performance of mourning was another essential element of this statecraft. The elaborate, expensive funeral was an investment in national stability. It gave the people an outlet for their anxiety and grief, channeling their emotions into a state-sanctioned ritual. The sight of the entire nobility and clergy marching in solemn procession was a powerful visual message. The state was strong, the succession was secure, and life would go on. The effigy played the most crucial role. In an age without photography or mass media, the physical image of the monarch was immensely powerful. The effigy, perfect and unchanging, replaced the messy reality of the dying queen. It allowed the public to mourn the idealized version of Elizabeth, the Gloriana of myth, rather than confronting the unsettling truth of her decay. It was a way of managing the collective psychology of the nation, ensuring that the memory of the great queen would be one of strength and majesty, not of sickness and horror. The stinking coffin had to be hidden because it represented the one truth that could not be spoken. The queen was not a goddess. She was a mortal, and the body politic was just as vulnerable to decay and chaos as her physical body. The frantic efforts to conceal the ruptured coffin were, in essence, an attempt to conceal the fragility of the state itself. The incident was a terrifying reminder that beneath the pomp and ceremony, the entire edifice of government rested on the frail, unpredictable foundation of a single human life. The transition from Tudor to Stuart was, in the end, a triumph of political stage management, a testament to the skill of men like Robert Cecil. But it was a success built upon a foundation of secrets and lies, the greatest of which was the carefully constructed myth of the Queen's serene and dignified end. The truth, as embodied by her rebellious corpse, was far too dangerous to be told. The final irony of Elizabeth's legacy is how the physical reality of her body has been almost completely erased by the power of her political myth. We remember the Armada speech, the portraits by Hilliard, the dazzling figure of the Virgin Queen. We do not remember the lead paint, the silence of the death watch, or the horrifying spectacle of her bursting coffin. The propaganda was just that successful. It has endured for over 400 years. But to truly understand Elizabeth, we must force ourselves to look past the myth and confront the grotesque reality. Her story is a powerful reminder that history is not just made by great deeds and political triumphs, but also by the quiet, hidden realities of human biology. The fate of nations can turn on a genetic flaw, a cerebral hemorrhage, or, in Elizabeth's case, the explosive decomposition of a body pushed beyond its limits. Her insistence on maintaining the fiction of her youth and strength, the very thing that defined her power, was also the thing that led to her agonizing decline and the post-mortem horror of her remains. She was consumed by the image she had created. When we think of Elizabeth, we should picture not just the ageless icon, but also the terrified old woman standing for weeks in a silent room, the prisoner of her own monarchy. We should remember the political genius, but also the victim of lead poisoning. And we should remember the magnificent effigy, but not without also acknowledging the stinking, ruptured coffin it concealed. Because it is in that chasm, between the myth and the reality, that the true, terrifying, and deeply human story of Queen Elizabeth I is to be found. She was a woman who became a goddess, and her tragedy was that in the end, her own mortal body was the one subject that refused to worship at her altar. It demanded its own, final, putrid truth be known, a truth that continues to haunt the marble silence of her tomb. The interment of Elizabeth in Westminster Abbey is a study in the layering of historical ironies. Her final tomb, which she shares with her half-sister Mary I, is a monument to a reconciliation that never happened, a fiction of sisterly unity designed to smooth over the brutal religious and political schisms of their reigns. Mary had been a devout Catholic who had burned Protestants. Elizabeth was the Protestant savior who had executed Catholics. Mary had married a foreign prince and subordinated England's interests to Spain. Elizabeth had built her legend on remaining a virgin, married only to her kingdom. To place them together, under a single monument celebrating their sisterhood, was a stunning act of historical revisionism by their Stuart successor, James I. It was a political move designed to signal an end to the religious strife of the Tudor era, and to present James himself as a unifier. By honoring both his Protestant predecessor and his Catholic ancestor, he was attempting to position himself above the fray. But for Elizabeth, it is a final, posthumous humiliation. She, who had prized her unique status and her independence above all else, is forced to share her memorial with the woman whose reign she had defined herself against. The inscription, "Consorts in Throne and Tomb," is a lie that negates the very essence of her life's work. The physical act of moving her coffin from her grandfather's vault to this new tomb is also significant. It underscores her status, even in death, as a political symbol to be manipulated by her successors. She was not allowed to rest in peace as the last of her line. She was conscripted into the propaganda of the new dynasty. The proximity of her tomb to that of her great rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, adds another layer of macabre irony. In life, Elizabeth had kept Mary a prisoner for nearly 2 decades, always aware of her as a threat, a potential Catholic replacement on the throne. The execution of Mary was the most difficult and dangerous decision of Elizabeth's reign. Now, in death, they are neighbors for eternity, 2 powerful queens forever locked in a silent marble standoff. One can only imagine the conversations of ghosts in the aisles of Westminster Abbey. This final arrangement speaks volumes about how the dead are used by the living. Elizabeth's memory and her physical remains were appropriated by the Stuarts to serve their own political narrative. The complexity and violence of her reign were smoothed over, repackaged into a story of dynastic harmony. The visitor to the Abbey today sees a magnificent tomb, a testament to a great queen. But they are also seeing a carefully crafted piece of political propaganda, a monument that conceals as much as it reveals. It hides the religious persecution, the political executions, the bitter rivalries, and the deep personal animosity that defined the Tudor court. And it certainly hides the story of the stinking, bursting coffin. The pristine marble effigy of Elizabeth that lies atop the tomb is the final victory of the myth over the reality. She is depicted as she wished to be seen, serene, ageless, majestic. The artists have smoothed away the wrinkles, ignored the blackened teeth, and forgotten the ravages of lead poisoning. This is the official, sanctioned memory, the one designed for public consumption. But for those who know the true story of her end, the tomb is a site of profound dissonance. We know what lies, or once lay, beneath that serene marble face. We know the story of the decay, the suffering, and the body that refused to go quietly into the night. The tomb is not a simple memorial. It is a contested space, a battleground between the carefully constructed myth of Gloriana and the foul, rebellious truth of Elizabeth's mortal flesh. Ultimately, the question of Elizabeth's final resting place forces us to confront the nature of historical memory itself. We are left with what the powerful chose to preserve: the grand tombs, the flattering portraits, the official chronicles. The messier, more human truths are often buried, hidden away like a ruptured coffin in a locked room. But they do not disappear entirely. They survive in whispers, in footnotes, in the margins of history, waiting for those who are willing to look past the marble and listen for the faint, horrifying echo of the truth. The very act of constructing a historical narrative is an act of curation, of choosing which facts to emphasize and which to suppress. The story of Elizabeth's death is a prime example of this process in action. The official narrative, promoted by Robert Cecil and the incoming Stuart regime, was one of pious tranquility. Chronicles of the time, written under the watchful eye of the new government, describe a queen who passed away peacefully after naming her successor. Her kingdom secure, her soul prepared to meet its maker. This was the story the nation needed to hear. It was a story of stability, continuity, and divine approval. It calmed fears of civil war and legitimized the transfer of power to a foreign king. But other, less official, accounts survived. The letter written by the courtier Elizabeth Southwell, a Catholic lady-in-waiting who had no love for the Protestant establishment, provides the most graphic and damning details of the Queen's grotesque end. Her account of the bursting coffin is a piece of counter-propaganda, a story told to strip away the heretic Queen's majesty and reveal her as a corrupt and damned creature. While her bias is clear, the forensic plausibility of her claims lends them a terrifying weight. We are left with two competing narratives: the state-sanctioned myth of a peaceful death and the dissident whisper of a horrifying one. History, in this case, is not a single, objective truth, but a battleground of stories. The dominance of the peaceful death narrative for centuries is a testament to the power of the state to control its own history. The story of the stinking coffin was too destabilizing, too improper to be included in the official record. It was relegated to the status of a morbid, unreliable rumor. This process of sanitization is not unique to Elizabeth. History is filled with such examples. The deaths of powerful leaders are almost always repackaged for public consumption. The brutal realities of illness, decay, and political maneuvering are smoothed over to preserve the dignity of the office and the stability of the state. What makes Elizabeth's case so compelling is the sheer chasm between the power of her myth and the squalor of her reality. She had built her entire identity on being more than human, on being a semi-divine figure. Therefore, the evidence of her very human, very messy mortality was an existential threat to the entire political order she had created. To analyze her death is to perform a kind of historical autopsy, peeling back the layers of propaganda to find the biological truth beneath. It requires us to be detectives weighing the evidence from biased sources, using modern science to assess the plausibility of long-forgotten rumors, and recognizing that the most powerful force in shaping history is often the desire to tell a convenient story. The fact that the story of the bursting coffin has survived at all is remarkable. It is a testament to the enduring power of a grotesque and shocking image, a truth so visceral that it refused to be completely buried. It reminds us that history is a living thing, that new evidence and new perspectives can challenge even the most entrenched myths. And it teaches us to be skeptical of any official story that seems too neat, too clean, too perfect. Often, the real story is to be found in the details that have been deliberately left out, in the whispers from the death chamber, and in the dark, foul secrets that a lead-lined coffin fails to contain.